Hello there, Sean Hutton here, and I would like to present an argument that I made earlier today regarding the letter to the Hebrews in the New Testament and the implications it has for the atonement theory, particularly penal substitutionary atonement. So Hebrews 11:13 reads, the bodies of the animals whose blood the high priest brings into the sanctuary as a sin offering are burned outside the camp. Therefore, Jesus also suffered outside the gate to consecrate the people by his own blood. Let us then go to him outside the camp, bearing the reproach that he bore. Let's focus on those words for a moment. So here's the argument. The fact that Hebrews indicates that Christ's suffering outside the gate, seemingly both a reference to him suffering outside of the city of Jerusalem, as well as a reference to him suffering outside of the heavenly sanctuary wall on earth, Christ's suffering in this context is a reproach that we are also to bear, and this indicates that the suffering in question is not wrath, not the full wrath of the Father, given in punishment for imputed sin, but rather is a reference to disciplinary suffering. The same term for reproach is also used in Hebrews 10:33 to refer to those who suffered while having faith and who were justified, and in Hebrews 11:26 refers to Moses considering the reproach of the anointed greater wealth than the treasures of Egypt, as he in faith chose to be ill-treated along with the people of God rather than enjoy the fleeting pleasure of sin, referring back to verse 25. The understanding that Hebrews is therefore providing is that justified Christians, alive and dead, like those who went before them, who were approved because of their faith, and died in faith, referring to 11:39 and 11:13, are called to share in the suffering, in the reproach that Christ suffered. As I have pointed out numerous times in the past, we then have parallelism going on in Hebrews 12, where the author speaks of the cloud of witnesses before us, hearkening back to chapter 11, where all of those heroes are referenced. And it's zeroing in on the example par excellence of Christ and how he endured the cross, 12:2, and endured such opposition from sinners, 12:3. This serves to lead into his next point, which is that Christians should look to that example as they avoid sin to the point of shedding blood, 12:4, being willing to endure our trials as discipline, 12:7. Notice that word endure and how Greek is the same, how it's used there, referring to what Christians are suffering, and how it was used earlier in the chapter to refer to what Christ was suffering. So what is this saying? It's saying that Christ, as the Son of the Father, suffered fatherly discipline on the cross, and that following in his footsteps, we are to do the same when we suffer fatherly discipline. What is this not saying? It's not saying that Christ, while ontologically the Son of the Father, was temporarily, not legally the Son of the Father, temporarily condemned as one with sin imputed to him, as if he's temporarily unjustified, etc. Such breaks the train of thought of the author, so that he's effectively saying, Christ endured wrath for you, so be willing to endure discipline. That's not what the text is saying, especially when pointing to Christ as the leader and perfecter of our faith. So this simply doesn't fit with the classical Protestant penal substitutionary readings of texts like Isaiah 53, Christ's cry of dereliction on the cross when he is quoting Psalm 22, doesn't fit with 2 Corinthians 5:21, doesn't fit with 1 Peter 2:24, etc. The biblical data cannot be harmonized and simultaneously support what Protestants who support penal substitutionary atonement insist that these proof texts mean. Christ was justified while on the cross. Christ never had any sin imputed to him. Christ suffered disciplinary punishment in solidarity with the justified, making sense of all the texts about suffering with Christ, like Romans 8:16-17, 2 Corinthians 1:5-7, Philippians 3:10-11, 1 Peter 4:13, etc., and what Jesus himself says about taking up our crosses. So if I'm wrong I challenge any Protestant proponent of penal substitutionary atonement to address my evidence and my argument and proceed to systematically refute what I am saying, demonstrate that the evidence actually supports sin imputed to Christ and that he was in fact suffering wrath, and that either there's some way that you can say that we suffer the reproach that Christ suffered without the obvious consequence of, well, Christ suffered X and we suffer X, whereas penal substitution is saying Christ suffered X so that we don't suffer X. There's a very big problem here. And that's before we even get into the fact that the notion that Christ suffered the full wrath of the Father doesn't fit with the evidence when it comes to the degree of punishment. He very clearly didn't spiritually die, and spiritual death is a punishment of the fall. He wasn't handed over to sinful behavior, and Romans 1 indicates that actually performing actual sins is part of the punishment of the fall. He didn't have disordered desires to sin or concupiscence, which again is part of the punishment of the fall. He didn't go to hell temporarily or eternally. Let's not misinterpret what the Apostles' Creed is actually saying when it's talking about he descended into hell. It's not talking about him going to the hell of the damned in any respect. It's talking about him going to the abode of the dead, right? He descended to the dead is how it used to get translated, but the more literal translation of the descent into hell, is going to use that wording, but it's still not talking about the hell of the damned. When we're looking at this evidence, it really just doesn't support penal substitutionary atonement. Christ doesn't suffer enough for us to say he suffered the full wrath of the Father, and all of this biblical language about us sharing in his suffering and us bearing the reproach that he bore, it just doesn't fit. It does fit with Christ's suffering discipline, but that means that penal substitutionary atonement is effectively out the window. Now, if someone wishes to bypass most of the argumentation I provided and simply argue that I can't be right, utilize, say, a reductio ad absurdum. Okay, say that since I haven't provided a full-blown alternative atonement model, then I'm basically taking any sense of substitutionary atonement and throwing it out the window. That's not what I'm doing. I'm distinguishing between what I would say is classical substitutionary atonement and penal substitutionary atonement. And we can get bogged down in the terminology. I know that there's plenty of Catholic proponents of the language of saying penal substitutionary atonement. But at the end of the day, the way I'm defining penal substitutionary atonement in this context has to do with sin imputed to Christ, Christ suffering full wrath for that sin, right? Christ suffering the wrath of the Father for the sin that is imputed or legally reckoned by God as being upon his shoulders. So I'm saying that that view does not fit with the biblical text. Don't need to appeal to the church fathers on this. I'm just going off of the Bible. So using scripture alone, for the sake of argument, can any Protestants take the argument that I'm making right now and, disprove it, push it out of the way, in order to protect penal substitutionary atonement as a valid, coherent atonement model? I'm not saying that when Christ takes on human nature and suffers our temporal consequences, I'm not saying that he's solely a moral exemplar, right? It's a moral influence view of the atonement. Hebrews 12 does portray Christ as an example to follow, right? Christ is also, though, the one who enables us to suffer with him, who gives us the strength to do so, who empowers us, who gives meaning and significance and efficacy to our sufferings such that they are capable of being mediums through which we are sanctified by him and by his most precious blood. It is only in suffering with him in a true ontological sense that we can be purified and made holy, from our baptism where we are baptized into his death to our literal physical deaths where we continue to be conformed to Christ by Christ. So I really would like to hear an explanation of Hebrews 13:13 and the surrounding context, and really all these references about Christ sharing, he shares in our suffering and we share in his, right? We share in the sufferings of Christ. How does that fit with penal substitutionary atonement? The only thing that I can come up with as a potential explanation for the pro-PSA side is when it's talking about the reproach, it's solely referring to this exterior persecution on the part of others. That just like Christ, we can experience, reproach of others persecuting us, and that's as far as it goes. And it's not going so far as to say that the nature of the experience is qualitatively the same. It's not going so far as to say, discipline. And so therefore it's still compatible with Christ suffering wrath and us suffering discipline. I still think that the tenor of Hebrews 12 really goes against that type of an explanation. And you're still then left, if you're going to take all the physical experiences Christ is having on that cross that are actually described in the Passion accounts and say, well, that's all fine to say that Christ's kind of experiencing that in solidarity with us. But the true wrath is kind of this invisible wrath that the Father is hitting Christ with at the same time. That's nowhere biblically described anywhere. All of the passages that we have in view here, like Isaiah 53, it's all compatible with focusing on the suffering and the persecution on the part of his enemies that Christ is being subjected to. That's what the focus is. There's no exegetical room. There's no reason to come up with this idea of the Father simultaneously hitting Christ with this invisible, wrath that is just nowhere indicated anywhere. It really becomes a serious problem. So I'd like to see somebody engage with this argument. I've made this argument for some time now, and I have not really felt like a Protestant interlocutor has attacked the argument head on. So let's see if somebody can.